Well, hello there. Welcome back to A People's Historian. I'm Jason Kishinev. Each episode we'll read about 30 minutes out of a history book. Right now we're trying to finish up chapter 21 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. We're reading about the Reagan years moving into the Bush years. Shall we dig in? The CIA now had to prove that it was still needed. The New York Times, February 4th, 1992, I almost said 1922. President Bush wasn't president then. The New York Times, February 4th, 1992, declared that in a world where the post-war enemy had ceased to exist, the CIA and its handful of sister agencies with their billion-dollar satellites and mountains of classified documents must somehow remain relevant in the minds of Americans. The military budget remained huge. Nothing changed since then. The Cold War budget of $300 billion was reduced by 7% to $280 billion. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, said, "I want to scare the hell out of the rest of the world. I don't say that in a bellicose way." That sounds bellicose to me. As if to prove that the giant military establishment was still necessary, the Bush administration, in its 4-year term, launched 2 wars. A small one against Panama and a massive one against Iraq. Coming into office in 1989, George Bush was embarrassed by the new defiant posture of Panama's dictator, General Manuel Noriega. Noriega's regime was corrupt, brutal, authoritarian, but President Reagan and Vice President Bush had overlooked this because Noriega was useful to the United States. He also graduated from the famed School of the Americas that we covered earlier. He cooperated with the CIA in many ways, such as offering Panama as a base for Contra operations against the Sandinista government of Nicaragua and meeting with Colonel Oliver North to discuss sabotage targets in Nicaragua. When he was the director of the CIA in 1976-1977, Bush had protected Noriega. I didn't realize he was only CIA director for 2 years. But by 1987, Noriega's usefulness was over. His activities in the drug trade were in the open, and he became a convenient target for an administration which wanted to prove that the United States, apparently unable to destroy the Castro regime or the Sandinistas or the revolutionary movement in El Salvador, was still a power in the Caribbean. Claiming that it wanted to bring Noriega to trial as a drug trafficker. He had been indicted in Florida under that charge, and also that it needed to protect U.S. citizens. A military man and his wife had been threatened by Panamanian soldiers. The United States invaded Panama in December 1989 with 26,000 troops. It was a quick victory. Noriega was captured and brought to Florida to stand trial, where he was subsequently found guilty and sent to prison. But in the invasion, neighborhoods in Panama City were bombarded and hundreds, perhaps thousands of civilians were killed. It was estimated that 14,000 were homeless. Writer Mark Hertzgaard noted that even if the official Pentagon figure of several hundred civilian casualties was correct, this meant that in Panama the U.S. had killed as many people as did the Chinese government in its notorious attack on student demonstrators in Tiananmen Square in Beijing 6 months earlier. A new president friendly to the United States was installed in Panama, but poverty and unemployment remained. And in 1992, the New York Times reported that the invasion and removal of Noriega failed to staunch the flow of illicit narcotics through Panama. The United States, however, succeeded in one of its aims to reestablish its strong influence over Panama. The Times reported the president of Panama and his key aides and the American ambassador Dean Hinton have breakfast together once a week in a meeting that many Panamanians view as the place where important decisions are made. Liberal Democrats John Kerry and Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts and many others declared their support of the military action. The Democrats were being true to their historic role as supporters of military intervention, anxious to show that foreign policy was bipartisan. They seemed determined to show that they were as tough or as ruthless as the Republicans. And it was like that too. But the Panama operation was on too small a scale to accomplish what both the Reagan and Bush administrations badly wanted: to overcome the American public's abhorrence since Vietnam of foreign military interventions. 2 years later, the Gulf War against Iraq presented such an opportunity. Iraq, under the brutal dictatorship of Saddam Hussein, had taken over its small but oil-rich neighbor, Kuwait, in August 1990. George Bush needed something at this point to boost his popularity among American voters. The Washington Post, October 16, 1990, had a front-page story headline: "Poll shows plunge in public confidence. Bush's rating plummets." The Post reported, "Some observers in his own party worry that the president will be forced to initiate combat to prevent further erosion of his support at home." On October 30th, a secret decision was made for war against Iraq. The United Nations had responded to the invasion of Kuwait by establishing sanctions against Iraq. Witness after witness testified before congressional committees in the fall of 1990 that the sanctions were having an effect and should continue. Secret CIA testimony to the Senate affirmed that Iraq's imports and exports had been reduced by more than 90% because of the sanctions. But after the November elections brought gains for the Democrats in Congress, Bush doubled American military forces in the Gulf to 500,000, creating what was now clearly an offensive force rather than a defensive one. According to Elizabeth Drew, a writer for The New Yorker, Bush's aide John Sununu was telling people that a short, successful war would be pure political gold for the president and would guarantee his re-election. Historian John Wiener, analyzing the domestic context of the war decision shortly afterward, wrote that Bush abandoned sanctions and chose war because his time frame was a political one set by the approaching 1992 presidential elections. That and the long-time U.S. wish to have a decisive voice in the control of Middle East oil resources were the crucial elements in the decision to go to war against Iraq. Shortly after the war, as representatives of the 13 oil-producing nations were about to gather in Geneva, the business correspondent of the New York Times wrote, "By virtue of its military victory, the United States is likely to have more influence in the organization of petroleum exporting countries than any industrial nation has ever exercised. Money." But those motives were not presented to the American public. It was sold that the United States wanted to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi control. The major media dwelled on this as a reason for war without noting that other countries had been invaded without the United States showing such concern. East Timor and Indonesia, Iran by Iraq, Lebanon by Israel, Mozambique by South Africa, to say nothing of countries invaded by the United States itself, Grenada, Panama. The justification for war that seemed most compelling was that Iraq was on its way to building a nuclear bomb. But the evidence for this was very weak. Before the crisis over Kuwait, Western intelligence sources had estimated it would take Iraq 3 to 10 years to build a nuclear weapon. Even if Iraq could build a bomb in a year or two, which was their most pessimistic estimate, it had no delivery system to send it anywhere. Besides, Israel already had nuclear weapons, and the United States had perhaps 30,000 of them. The Bush administration was trying hard to develop a paranoia in the nation about an Iraqi bomb which did not yet exist. Bush seemed determined to go to war. There had been several chances to negotiate an Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait right after the invasion, including an Iraqi proposal reported on August 29th by Newsday correspondent Knut Royce. But there was no response from the United States. When Secretary of State James Baker went to Geneva to meet with Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz, the instruction from Bush was no negotiations. Despite months of exhortation from Washington about the dangers of Saddam Hussein, surveys showed that less than half of the public favored military action. In January 1991, Bush, apparently feeling the need for support, asked Congress to give him the authority to make war. This was not a declaration of war as called for by the Constitution, but since Korea and Vietnam, that provision of the Constitution seemed dead, and even the strict constructionists on the Supreme Court, who prided themselves on taking the words of the Constitution literally and seriously, would not intervene. The debate in Congress was lively. At one point, a Senate speech was interrupted by protesters in the balcony shouting, "No blood for oil!" The protesters were hustled out by guards. It is likely that Bush was sure of having enough votes, or he would have launched the invasion without congressional approval. After all, the precedent for ignoring Congress and the Constitution had been set in Korea, Vietnam, Grenada, Panama. The Senate voted for military action by only a few votes. The House supported the resolution by a larger majority. However, once Bush ordered the attack on Iraq, both houses, with just a few dissents, Democrats as well as Republicans, voted to support the war and support the troops. You wouldn't be against kittens, would you? It was in mid-January 1991, after Saddam Hussein defied an ultimatum to leave Kuwait, that the U.S. launched its air war against Iraq. It was given the name Desert Storm. The government and the media had conjured up a picture of a formidable military power, but Iraq was far from that. The U.S. Air Force had total control of the air and could bomb at will. Not only that, U.S. officials had virtual total control of the airwaves. The American public was overwhelmed with television photos of smart bombs and confident statements that laser bombs were being guided with perfect precision to military targets. The major networks presented all of these claims without question or criticism. This confidence in smart bombs sparing civilians may have contributed to a shift in... Let me say that sentence over again. The confidence in smart bombs sparing civilians may have contributed to a shift in public opinion from being equally divided on going to war to perhaps 85% support for the invasion. You wouldn't be against kittens, would you? Perhaps more important in winning over public support was that Once American military were engaged, it seemed to many people who had previously opposed military action that to criticize it now meant betraying the troops who were there. Kittens. All over the nation, yellow ribbons were displayed as a symbol of support for the forces in Iraq. In fact, the public was being deceived about how smart the bombs being dropped on Iraqi towns were. After talking with former intelligence and Air Force officers, a correspondent for the Boston Globe reported that perhaps 40% of the laser-guided bombs dropped in Operation Desert Storm missed their targets. John Lehman, Secretary of the Navy under President Reagan, estimated there had been thousands of civilian casualties. The Pentagon officially had no figure on this. A senior Pentagon official told the Globe, "To tell you the truth, we're not really focusing on this question." A Reuters dispatch from Iraq described the destruction of a 73-room hotel in a town south of Baghdad and quoted an Egyptian witness. "They hit the hotel, full of families, and then they came back to hit it again." Reuters reported that the air raids on Iraq first used laser-guided bombs, but within a few weeks turned to B-52s, which carried conventional bombs, meaning more indiscriminate bombing. American reporters were kept from seeing the war close up, and their dispatches were subject to censorship, apparently recalling how press reports of civilian casualties had affected public opinion during the Vietnam War. The U.S. government was taking no chances this time. A Washington Post reporter complained about the control of information, writing, "The bombing has involved dozens of high-flying B-52 bombers equipped with huge unguided munitions, but the Pentagon has not allowed interviews with B-52 pilots, shown videotapes of their actions, or answered any questions about the operations of an aircraft that is the most deadly and least accurate in the armada of more than 2,000 U.S. and Allied planes in the Persian Gulf region." In mid-February, U.S. planes dropped bombs on an air raid shelter in Baghdad at 4 in the morning, killing 400 to 500 people. An Associated Press reporter, who was one of few allowed to go to the site, said most of the recovered bodies were charred and mutilated beyond recognition. Some clearly were children. The Pentagon claimed it was a military target, but the Associated Press reporter on the scene said no evidence of any military presence could be seen inside the wreckage. Other reporters who inspected the site agreed. Excuse me. After the war, 15 Washington News Bureau chiefs complained in a joint statement that the Pentagon exercised virtual total control over the American press during the Gulf War. But while it was happening, leading television news commentators behaved as if they were working for the United States government. For instance, CBS correspondent Dan Rather, perhaps the most widely seen of the TV newsmen, reported from Saudi Arabia on a film showing a laser bomb, this one dropped by British aircraft in support of the American war, hitting a marketplace and killing civilians. Rather's only comment was, "We can be sure that Saddam Hussein will make propaganda of these casualties." When the Russian government tried to negotiate an end to the war, bringing Iraq out of Kuwait before the ground war could get underway, top CBS correspondent Leslie Stahl asked another reporter, "Isn't this the nightmare scenario? Aren't the Soviets trying to stop us?" The final stage of the war, barely 6 weeks after it had begun, was a ground assault which, like the air war, encountered virtually no resistance. With victory certain and the Iraqi army in full flight, U.S. planes kept bombing the retreating soldiers who clogged the highway out of Kuwait City. A reporter called the scene a blazing hell, a gruesome testament To the east and west across the sand lay the bodies of those fleeing. A Yale professor of military history, Michael Howard, writing in the New York Times, January 28, 1991, quoted the military strategist Clausewitz approvingly. The fact that a bloody slaughter is a horrifying act must make us take war more seriously, but not provide an excuse for gradually blunting our swords in the name of humanity. Howard went on to say, in this conflict of wills, the bottom line remains a readiness to kill and be killed. The human consequences of the war became shockingly clear after its end, when it was revealed that the bombings of Iraq had caused starvation, disease, and the deaths of tens of thousands of children. A UN team visiting Iraq immediately after the war reported that the recent conflict has brought near apocalyptic results upon the infrastructure. Most means of modern life support have been destroyed or rendered tenuous. A Harvard medical team reporting in May said that child mortality had risen steeply and that 55,000 more children died in the first 4 months of the year. The war lasted from January 15th to February 28th, than in a comparable period the year before. The director of a pediatric hospital in Baghdad told a New York Times reporter that on the first night of the bombing campaign, the electricity was knocked out. Mothers grabbed their children out of incubators, took intravenous tubes out of their arms. Others were removed from oxygen tents, and they ran to the basement where there was no heat. I lost more than 40 prematures in the first 12 hours of the bombing. Although in the course of the war, Saddam Hussein had been depicted by U.S. officials and the press as another Hitler, the war ended short of a march into Baghdad, leaving Hussein in power. It seemed that the United States had wanted to weaken him but not to eliminate him, in order to keep him as a balance against Iran. In the years before the Gulf War, the United States had sold arms to both Iran and Iraq at different times, favoring one or the other as part of the traditional balance of power strategy. Therefore, as the war ended, the United States did not support Iraqi dissidents who wanted to overthrow the regime of Saddam Hussein. A New York Times dispatch from Washington, datelined March 26, 1991, reported President Bush has decided to let President Saddam Hussein put down rebellions in his country without American intervention, rather than risk the splintering of Iraq, according to official statements and private briefings today. This left the Kurdish minority, which was rebelling against Saddam Hussein, helpless, and anti-Hussein elements among the Iraqi majority were also left hanging. The Washington Post reported May 3, 1991, major defections from the Iraqi military were in the offing in March at the height of the Kurdish rebellion, but never materialized because the officers concluded the U.S. could not back the uprising. The man who had been Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, a month after the end of the Gulf War, gave a cold assessment of the pluses and minuses of the event. The benefits are undeniably impressive. First, a blatant act of aggression was rebuffed and punished. Second, U.S. military power is henceforth likely to be taken more seriously. Third, the Middle East and Persian Gulf region is now clearly an American sphere of preponderance. Brzezinski, however, was concerned about some negative consequences. One of them was that the very intensity of the air assault on Iraq gives rise to concern that the conduct of the war may come to be seen as evidence that Americans view Arab lives as worthless, and that raises the moral question of the proportionality of response. His point about Arab lives being seen as worthless was underlined by the fact that the war provoked an ugly wave of anti-Arab racism in the United States, with Arab Americans insulted or beaten or threatened with death. There were bumper stickers that said, "I don't break for Iraqis." An Arab American businessman was beaten in Toledo, Ohio. Brzezinski's measured assessment of the Gulf War can be taken as close to representing the view of the Democratic Party. It went along with the Bush administration. It was pleased with the results. It had some misgivings about civilian casualties, but it did not constitute an opposition. President George Bush was satisfied. As the war ended, he declared on a radio broadcast, "The specter of Vietnam has been buried forever in the desert sands of the Arabian Peninsula." Not a good push. The establishment press very much agreed. The two leading news magazines, Time and Newsweek, had special editions hailing the victory in the war, noting there had been only a few hundred American casualties without any mention of Iraqi casualties. A New York Times editorial, March 30th, 1991, said, "America's victory in the Persian Gulf War provided special vindication for the U.S. Army." Rats, I almost made it. Provided special vindication for the U.S. Army, which brilliantly exploited its firepower and mobility, and in the process erased memories of its grievous difficulties in Vietnam. A black poet in Berkeley, California, June Jordan, had a different view. "I suggest to you it's a hit the same way that crack is, and it doesn't last long." That, my friends, is the end of the chapter. Please hit the subscribe button, the like button, the notification bell in no particular order, and tune in next time. We'll read chapter 22 about unreported resistance, pretty much going into the Clinton years. And we'll see you then. Thanks for joining me.